Joseph, righteous man, vizier to Pharaoh, dreamer, and deceiver, the one whom Jesus' earthly father was probably named after. So who was Joseph? Now Joseph was a Hebrew man who was one of Jacob's 12 sons. Understand, this is the foundational family in the Old Testament, the forefathers of Israel, who will be the family in which Jesus Christ would be born into. Now Joseph, he was the son of Jacob, later named Israel's old age. And for that he was loved more and his brothers hated him. Genesis 37 verses 3 to 4. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any other of his sons, because he was the son of his old age. And he made him a robe of many colors. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peacefully to him. That's the first aspect of Joseph. Now the other part is that Joseph was a dreamer of dreams, and this also bred resentment among his 11 brothers, or at least 10 of them. Genesis 37 verses 5 to 8. Now Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. He said to them, "Hear this dream that I have dreamed. Behold, we are binding sheaves in the field. And behold, my sheaf arose and stood upright. And behold, your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf." His brothers said to him, "Are you indeed to reign over us, or are you indeed to rule over us?" So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. The next verse records he had another dream. "I have dreamed another dream. Behold, the sun, the moon, and the 11 stars were bowing down to me." Now this dream is prophetic, and the sun and the moon and the 11 stars seems to refer to his mother and his father, but definitely his 11 brothers bowing down to him. And the cosmic imagery reveals the momentous nature of this, is God would use Joseph as a sort of savior for the Middle East, and definitely an instrument in his plan for humanity as a whole. This man is very important. But his story started out with betrayal, for his brothers threw him into a pit. At first, they were actually going to kill him. As Genesis 37 verses 18 to 20, they had such resentment and they wanted to kill him to see what would become of this dreamer's dreams, of everyone bowing down to him. But then Reuben stepped in. I like Reuben. He's like the cooler, older brother with his head on his shoulders. He suggested that the brothers should throw Joseph into the pit instead of killing him outright, and he said this because he planned to restore him to his father after the fact. Genesis 37, 22 to 24 reads, "And Reuben said to them, Shed no blood, throw him into this pit here in the wilderness, but do not lay a hand on him, that he might rescue him out of their hand to restore him to their father." So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the robe of many colors that he wore, and they took him and threw him into a pit. The pit was empty, there was no water in it, so it was a barren cistern there. Jacob had sent Joseph to his brothers in the first place to see if them and the flock were all right in Shechem, and they planned to kill him, but instead he was thrown into a pit, and when some traders had gone by, they decided to sell him. It seems like Reuben had gone away for a little bit, or that he had stepped away when the transaction had occurred, because Judah steps in after the fact and suggests, on a similar level, what good is it to kill our own blood? Joseph is our own family, our own flesh. We shouldn't kill him, but instead let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, the passing traders. So that's what Judah, the brother, suggested. That's what they did. So they ended up selling Joseph for 20 shekels, and Joseph was brought to Egypt. And a little bit back to Reuben. When Reuben returned to the pit, and he saw that Joseph was not in the pit, he tore his clothes and returned to his brothers and said, "The boy is gone, and where shall I go?" Now this is neat, because Reuben, like I said before, was the oldest brother. He seems like he's a cool guy in the Old Testament, but the responsibility would have especially fallen on him if anything had happened to Joseph. Also, if anyone knows the story, he already disrespected his father once by sleeping with his concubine. Now, a concubine was basically like a wife in everything but name. So Reuben had ended up sleeping with his father's concubine on his own couch. So that's obviously lustful in nature, but it's also potentially a power move, because by doing that he was challenging Jacob as the alpha, as the head of the house. That's Genesis 35. So point is, Reuben already disrespected his father, and now with Joseph going missing, it was really a bad situation on him with everything that played out. Now Reuben also feels regret later on when him and his brothers are detained in Egypt, and he sees it as retribution for what they had done, just not to their brother Joseph. But that wasn't the end of the story. Joseph, on the other side, he rose the ranks. And then we get to Genesis 39 for an overview of the righteous man's story. Now Joseph had been brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, had bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man, and he was in the house of his Egyptian master. His master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord caused all that he did to succeed in his hands. So Joseph found favor in his sight, and attended him, and he made him overseer of his house, and put him in charge of all that he had. The Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. The blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in house and field. God was with Joseph, and God was going to use Joseph. So we're in this Egyptian's house, this pagan's house, and God was even blessing him for Joseph's sake. So we see Joseph rise in the ranks. He was a good servant, a respectful servant, that he gave him control of the entire household, basically. But Joseph was handsome in form and appearance, and after a time his master's wife cast her eyes on Joseph and said, "Lie with me." Verses 6 to 10, but he refused and said to his master's wife, "Behold, because of me my master has no concern about anything in the house, and he has put everything that he has in my charge. He is not greater in this house than I am, nor has he kept back anything from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" Now she spoke to Joseph day after day. He would not listen to her, to lie beside her, or to be with her. Now this is the ESV, by the way. This is a really interesting story. Basically, Joseph was an attractive man. He probably had broad shoulders, decent muscular build, I would think. But his master's wife saw him. She wanted to lie with him. But Joseph knew that would be sinning against God. So even centuries before Christ, we see an example of crucifying the flesh, or so to speak, not doing what you would naturally do, what the natural instinct would be, because you know it violates God's standard. So we see Joseph being a great precedent here. That brings me also to 1 Corinthians 6:18, flee from sexual immorality. Because Paul, in this letter to the Corinthian church, tells us that sin, when we do sin, generally it's external, it's against someone else. But when we sin sexually, that's a sin against our own body, because we're sinning with parts that were made in God's image for God's purpose. And so another thing too, is that when you get to sexual sin, it's the only sin where Paul directly just says flee from it, not fight back, just flee. And I think that has to do with the temptation factor with sexual sin in general, because it's something that I've struggled with personally. And for the believer today, because we see that there is a lot of application here for the modern day believer. Not that we allegorize willy-nilly, but we can look and see these examples. Joseph is a great example. And today, for believers in God and his Christ, one should abide in Christ. What that means is not get so caught up in just the intellectual side of things and putting all the pieces together, which I love to do and is joyous to do. Generally have a relationship and a commitment to Christ, where you're a willingness to crucify the flesh. In other words, what you would normally do, just out of being horny or whatever. Not doing that for God's sake. Being disciplining yourself for the Lord. And also, especially in the example of pornography, taking practical steps to distance yourself, as that's a very common way for sexual sin and these types of things to happen in the modern day, more so I think than fornication. But besides all this, The first time I read this story, I thought Joseph was like Superman. I didn't think he was tempted at all, because I figured, well, Joseph. I'm a man, but Joseph must have been a pretty stand-up guy. I figured he wasn't even tempted. But the thing is, Joseph was a man. Of course, he was tempted when this woman was throwing herself at him, and woman was presenting herself to Joseph to lie with her, and you can imagine just the situation and even the physical reaction. But he crucified his flesh. He walked away from that to honor God, and that played an important role in the story. Now, one time, she approached him again, and again he was in his routine of running away and not getting with her and doing evil with her. But when he was running away the next time, she grabbed onto his garment, and when he ran away, it ripped apart. So anyone that would come after her, the guards and later her husband, she would tell them that Joseph actually raped her and humiliated her and did all that type of thing. Now, this was a false accusation, but it got Joseph thrown into prison. Now, even here, God is with Joseph, and we see him prosper because the keeper of the prison put Joseph in charge. God is with him even here. Now, the cupbearer and chief baker of the Pharaoh had committed some offense against him and were thrown into prison, eventually under Joseph's custody. And one night, both of them dreamed, and they were troubled by their dreams. So Joseph said, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Please tell them to me. What did you dream?" Now the cupbearer had a dream about a vine with 3 branches, and then it budded, the blossoms shot forth, the clusters ripened into grapes, and he pressed them into Pharaoh's cup and handed it to Pharaoh. Joseph told him what it meant, that in 3 days, which would be Pharaoh's birthday, by the way, the cupbearer would be released, he would be pardoned and restored back. Now the baker, on the other hand, he had a dream where he had 3 cake baskets on his head. The top had a whole bunch of foods for Pharaoh, but the birds were eating from it. Then Joseph told him what it meant. In 3 days, Pharaoh, I love how it's worded, in 3 days Pharaoh will lift up your head from you and hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat the flesh from you. Now this interaction will play a role later, but what we see is Joseph is continuing in the Lord. He's being established as a dreamer and one to whom God gives the interpretations, just like Daniel. Another nuance is to consider the Christ moment. Now Jesus made it clear that the Old Testament scriptures are pointing to him the whole time. Now there's a prophetic category, something we call messianic prophecy, about the Messiah, the coming Messiah, what he's going to do, and in general God's plan of salvation. Especially when you see all these pieces put together, we see it aligned perfectly with Jesus' ministry. Now there's the prophecy section, but there's also the section of typology, which is basically seeing themes and parallels in the Old Testament being parallels to that of Christ. Now the early apostles and the early Christians understood this concept of there being these types of parallelism, these types of foreshadowing within the Old Testament. And Joseph, if you look exactly, reasonably was a type of Christ. Check this out. Christ and Joseph, they were both righteous men who are wrongly condemned. Both had 2 men with them. Jesus had the 2 robbers on either side. One of them was forgiven and accepted into the other heaven. The other will continue to revile him and reject him. And in the Joseph situation, one of the men, the cupbearer, was restored to his position and exalted, and the other one was killed. So we see that parallel right there. So what happened is now Pharaoh himself had a dream that bothered him. He asked the magicians and the cultic officials to explain it to him, but they didn't have an interpretation. So then the cupbearer, who was in prison, he remembered Joseph and he said, "Call Joseph in here. This man knows how to interpret dreams." So here we see Joseph rise even more now to the Pharaoh. And Joseph, or rather God I should say, through Joseph as a vessel, interpreted the dreams. And it's an amazing story because Pharaoh, who was surely a pagan, he recognized that Joseph's God was with him and became second to Pharaoh in the land of Egypt. Now, as far as the dreams, they were prophetic of a 7 years of famine within the Middle East. He had a dream about 7 beautiful cows that got eaten up by 7 ugly and shrill cows. And the ugly and shrill cows, even after they ate the nice, plump, and juicy cows, they still remained ugly and gross. Then he had a dream about ears of grain, 7 good ears of grain. And then he had another dream where bad, awkward, and bitter ones, withered ones, they came and sort of snuffed out the good grain, and the good ears, I should say, were no more. Now, Joseph even said the fact that this was a double dream with the same meaning, was surefire that what God is going to do is certain and it's going to come about soon. So Joseph was placed highly within the kingdom of Egypt, and Joseph from then planned so that in the 7 years of abundance, because what it meant, there would be 7 years of great abundance, but after that there would be 7 years of famine, so devastating the years of abundance would go like it was never even happened. So Joseph in that time stored up grain and foods, and when the years of famine came, Egypt was the one nation that had a food reserve that they could ration out to the people, even from other nations. Now, another interesting piece here is that Pharaoh renames Joseph Zephanath Paneah in verse 45 of Genesis 41. Zephanath Paneah. Now, that's a purely Egyptian word. And the interesting thing is here, there are different interpretations, scholarly, of what it means. Something it means finder of mysteries. Something it means the man to whom secrets are revealed, or the revealer of secrets. Some Egyptologists even think it means the salvation of the age. So Pharaoh renames Joseph this, and when you consider this in light of the parallel to Christ, that's pretty amazing, because Joseph was God's answer to the famine situation back then, but we see there's a parallel to Christ centuries later, even in the naming of the name. Especially the last one about the salvation of the age, that's directly a parallel to Christ, but even about the finder of mysteries and the revealer of secrets applies to Christ when you understand his role in God's plan. So basically, we're at a hard point. There's famine in the land, and the brothers who were in the land of Canaan came to the land of Egypt, hoping to get some food to bring back home, because again, bad situation. Reuben, so then we get back to Reuben. Initially he thought, did I not tell you to sin against the boy, but you did not listen? So now there comes a reckoning for his blood. It's Genesis 42:22. So now we get into a little plot arc of deception and planning, but all to the glory of God. So what we see is the brothers come initially, and Joseph recognizes his brothers, but the brothers don't recognize Joseph. He's probably full Egyptian in appearance and garb now. So Joseph knows that the brothers have come, and he pretends that they are spies. And he sort of orchestrates a scheme where he says, all right, if you're honest men, prove to me that you're honestly honest men and not spies. Go out, bring your youngest brother Benjamin to me. His name was Benjamin, and then I'll know that you aren't liars, and then I will let you out of my hand. So then they go back, they convince Jacob to bring Benjamin. Judah takes a pledge that if anything happens to Benjamin, just as it happened to Joseph, that's going to be on my personal guilt. So then they come back, everything seems good. They sneak one of Joseph's, I think it's one of his silver vessels or gold vessels, and put it in the bag of Benjamin, and the brothers don't realize. So when the brothers go out, they're heading back, then one of the servants follows them, claiming that they stole one of Pharaoh's things, or one of the vessels, as was planned beforehand. So Joseph was secretly planning beforehand. And what happened was they were like, all right, we didn't steal anything. Whoever you find in ownership of this stolen item, let him be your servant forever. And then they look, and it was in Benjamin's bag. So what that means is Benjamin, who they promised would come back, now legally under their pledge and agreement would be a servant to Pharaoh and a servant to Joseph. And he wouldn't go back to his father, because now he would be a slave to Joseph. Now Joseph planned all this beforehand because he knew that they were his brothers, and he wanted to see and be with Benjamin. He loved Benjamin, the youngest brother. So then they came back, and Judah just poured out his heart. He outcried. He said, "Listen, if we don't come back with Benjamin, my father's going to die." Jacob lost Joseph. Now if he lost Benjamin, please take me instead, but let Benjamin go back. And at this point, Joseph, it all came to the dude, and he just started bawling out. He started losing it. He told all the servants to get out, and then he finally revealed himself to his brothers. So we see in the end, it's a beautiful story. It's so neat that the brothers acted wickedly out of their jealousy early on, but now the brothers have repented of their sin and they're reconciled to Joseph. Jacob, later renamed Israel, he sees Joseph again and he's finally able to die in peace. Because understand, all this time Jacob thought that Joseph had been killed by a fierce animal, because after they sold him, that's what they went back and told their father. And he's been just gray and depressed, but now he finally realizes that Joseph was alive the whole time. He's able to die in peace. And then the family moves and they settle in Goshen, which is a land within Egypt. So it's a beautiful end to the book of Genesis, beautiful end to the story. But it also carries lasting themes. What we see is an important biblical theme that's, I would say, integral to the understanding of Scripture and to the nature of God, especially in light of certain atheist attacks or certain attacks on the character of God. We need to understand that God in His sovereignty uses evil for good. That's what we see in this story, but that also ties into God's messianic purposes. Now let me explain. Genesis 45:5. This is Joseph talking. "And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves that you have sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life." Verse 7, Genesis 45. "And God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, and to keep alive for you many survivors." So there's a blessing here in the general sense. Many people were able to stay alive because Egypt was calling it where it was responsible with their food in the land of famine. They were reliable for a lot of people. Egypt, Joseph saved a lot of lives. But also, if you guys know the story of the Bible, God planned to use Israel, specifically one Jew from Israel, the Messiah, to restore the nations of the world. And because people will ask, why the Jews? Why did God choose the Jews? Well, God chose this as His covenant people. He loves them. He made promises to them that are still yet to be fulfilled. But in terms of His global plan for salvation, He was going to use them, specifically one member from them, the Messiah, the Christ, to restore the nations back to God. This is God's biblical plan for salvation. So understand the depth of this then, because if the brothers had killed Joseph, or even more so if Joseph had actually slept with his master's wife and he found out, he probably would have been killed. So think, if this turned out any other way and there wasn't God's provision, then the famine would have come, Egypt wouldn't have been prepared, many more people would have died, and specifically and very likely the family of Israel would have died, meaning Jacob and the 12 sons you read about in Genesis. And if Jacob and the 12 sons died out and their lives weren't preserved, then centuries later we wouldn't have the family, the people for Jesus Christ to be born into. So understand how important Joseph was in God's entire plan, because it preserved what would become the nation of Israel, and from the nation of Israel, Christ. Now this is very deep. This is very cool. Joseph is an amazing character in the Old Testament. Very interesting story. God is good. I love doing these explain stories, Bible explain stories. Who was this? Who was that? Give me a holler if you want to see even more. I plan to do more. God bless you all. Hope this enlighten you. I will see you all in the next one.